Hello and welcome to a special episode on Viking.TV with me, Anne Diamond. And today I welcome you to the West Country city of Bristol. It's one of the oldest cities in Britain with a rich maritime history, but it's also the place where they built Concorde. And it's very famous for the Avon Gorge behind me, over which Isambard King de Brunel, the famous Victorian engineer, built the amazing Clifton Suspension Bridge. But today, Viking has asked me to tell you my story, to celebrate my being awarded a very special honour by the King. It's called an OBE, Order of the British Empire, and it's given in recognition of something special that you were able to achieve in your life. It's a tremendous thing, and I don't think I've quite left cloud 9 yet, after going along to the palace and meeting the King in front of my sons.
Many countries in the world today have honours and awards of one sort or another, but nowhere is the bestowing of titles and decorations performed in such splendid surroundings and with such grace, style and ceremony.
Civil Division, and Mrs. Diamond for services to public health and to charity.
I think one of the most important aspects of an investiture is to be able to reward in a suitable way the selfless service and dedication of so many of these remarkable people. People who've dedicated their lives in all sorts of sort of unseen areas. I'm aware, only too aware, that for the vast majority of people who come to an investiture, it is a very important moment in their lives when they're being given an honour and a reward and a thank you for all the marvellous things they've done.
Do you want to see it? There it is. It's a sort of medal called an OBE, and I'm very proud of it too. So why am I in Bristol right now to tell you all about this? Well, I love Bristol because it's actually where I started my TV career, but it's also a place I came to back at one of the very worst times in my life, when my third son Sebastian died of cot death, or what you probably call crib death. That was back in 1991. It was my eldest son Oliver's 4th birthday, and when I went into Sebastian's room, I encountered what I can only ever describe as every mother's nightmare, which is my little boy was a stiff, cold statue of a child instead of the warm, cuddly, milky baby that I'd put to bed the night before. And I just screamed. I was just rocking my very, very little cold baby. And it was actually painful to hold him because he was so cold. Downstairs I could hear commotions at the front door, and reporters and photographers were desperately trying to push their way in. I remember at one point Oliver just turned around really, really quietly and said, "Can I open any of my presents now?" And we suddenly, all of us tear-stained and dealing with the horror of the moment, suddenly turned to him and thought, oh my goodness, yes, it's his birthday. No one could tell me why it should have happened to him. No one seemed to know anything about it. Top doctors and scientists seemed to think it was just one of those terrible things that happens in life. People actually told me to cheer up and have another one. But all my questions in the end led me here, where one man was discovering possible answers. His amazing work, together with what I was able to do to help build a national campaign, is estimated to have saved more than 30,000 babies' lives and has had tremendous influence throughout the world. You'll want to meet him. So Peter, if you go back 35 years, maybe even more, it's easy to forget what it was like. Can you describe what it was like, the situation with cot death or crib death as we know it?
Yeah, well, as a paediatrician working here in Bristol, I was in charge of the Children's Intensive Care Unit, and at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, even 3 times a week in winter, I would be called to the emergency department for a child being brought in, people trying to resuscitate a baby who'd been found collapsed at home. Almost all of them died. We were very seldom successful in resuscitating them. So this was something I was seeing many times a week during the winter, less often during the summer. In our intensive care unit, our ED alone, we were seeing 50 to 60 such deaths every year.
And that's an incredibly high proportion.
It's a large number. I mean, it was about 3 out of about 1 in 300 babies born at that time was dying suddenly and unexpectedly.
And so if one was brought in and you tried your very best to resuscitate it, afterwards, what was your conclusion?
We had no idea. We called it sudden infant death syndrome, crib death, cot death, but we really didn't understand what it was. I ran the physiology lab, and we were doing a lot of work trying to look at some of the factors that might be important. We were looking at control of breathing, control of temperature, the effect of infection. We were getting little bits of clues as to what might be contributing, but we really weren't getting very far. Part of that process, at the end of that, what I started to do was, when the families would almost always have come in the ambulance with the child, so they needed to get home. And so once there was no more we could do, I started offering to take them home. So I used to drive the families home from the hospital. And very often they would say, come and see where it happened. Mm. And the families invited me into the baby's room, and it started looking at what had happened, talking through with them what had happened.
Because they're asking, and presumably hoping that you can give them some sort of
absolutely. Did we do it wrong? Was it our fault? How can we stop this happening? Can we help stop it happening to other families? So this was really, we had no real knowledge. I started collecting that data in great detail. And the opportunity arose in the late 1980s. We put in an application to do some research. I was very convinced that one of the major effects contributing to these deaths was heavy wrapping, over wrapping, temperature imbalance, combined with infection, a minor infection, tipping the baby over into problems. We got funding from the Foundation for Study of Infant Deaths, a big charity in the UK, to do a large population study investigating all the unexpected deaths that occurred and comparing them to normal surviving healthy infants in the same community.
That's what you call a control. Can you explain what a control is?
A control was a child. The way we did it was for every baby who died, they had a community child health nurse, what we call a health visitor. And the health visitor would have a number of babies on her workload with the families she was working with. And so for every baby who died, we asked their health visitor to put us in contact with the 2 families on her list, with the babies closest in age to the one who had just died. We then contacted those families and asked if they'd be willing to help us with the study. And they were desperate to do so, because this was, the whole community would know that a death had occurred. So these families were incredibly cooperative and helpful, gave us a lot of information.
So you're looking at all of the instances surrounding the baby who had died and 2 more who hadn't died.
Exactly, but they were the same age, in the same community, and the same time of year. So we were looking at these families, collecting that information. Now, when we were planning that study, I was really convinced that temperature and infection were going to be crucial factors. There was a paediatrician in Australia called Susan Beale, who kept telling me at these big international meetings, it's all down to sleeping position. They're dying because they're lying on their tummies. I thought that was too simplistic. I just didn't believe it. But partly in order to stop Susan shouting at me at meetings, we put it into our study.
So you started to ask that question?
We started collecting detailed information, not only on how much wrapping and infections and so on, but what position the baby had been put down in and what position they were found in. We ran that study in the west of England here for the next 2 years, and towards the end of that period, we started analysing the data. It became absolutely barn door obvious that the single most important factor was putting the babies down on their tummy. Heavy wrapping was important. Infections were important, but if you put the baby down on its tummy, the statistics told us the baby was 10 times as likely to die as if you put them down on their back.
How did you feel when that data started to explain itself?
I couldn't believe it. It's too simple. Scientific studies have seldom come up with an answer that's quite as simple and stark as that. The odds ratios we were getting were stronger than the ones that Bradford Hill had found in relation between smoking and lung cancer. Statistical studies don't do that.
Say that again. The link between a baby sleeping on its front and cot death, crib death, is stronger than the evidence between smoking and lung cancer.
The original studies on smoking and lung cancer, the Bradford Hill study in the early 1960s, came up with a weaker odds ratio than the one we were finding. So my immediate response was, we've got it wrong. That just can't happen. Statistics don't work that way. Epidemiology doesn't work that way. So we spent several months reanalyzing, re-looking at it, getting other experts to look at the data, because we couldn't, I didn't want to go public with something which someone then say, that's all down to that. We couldn't find anything. So in early 1989, the very first international meeting of the newly formed SIDS International Study Group in London, I gave the opening talk and presented some of that data. It's never been presented anywhere before. People were very incredulous. They thought, this is too simplistic, it can't be true.
Well, actually, they were nastier to you.
They were quite unpleasant. There were people telling me I was doing wrong. The Times, our biggest national newspaper, ran a feature saying that I was being irresponsible and that telling people something that couldn't be true. So it was really difficult. But we then carried on. In the area where we work here in the west of England, we work very closely with families, with family doctors, and with community health nurses, health visitors and midwives. So we presented this data. The first people we ever presented it to was the families and their healthcare people, because that's what we told them we would do.
Yes.
We said we'd give it back to you before we give it to anybody else.
What was their reaction?
They were utterly astounded. But the effect of that was we then went on to try and do a follow-on study to see if we could understand the mechanism.
Yeah. Yes, because that's the obvious question. Why would sleep
why
position
does it matter?
be important?
Yeah, so we wanted to do some really detailed
And
measurements.
what position were mothers sleeping their babies predominantly at the time?
At the time, about 70 to 80% of babies were put down on their tummies. So I wanted to know, why does this have an effect? Is it real? Are we missing something? Is there something else? So that same year, 1989, we started the next study looking at what it was about sleeping position that made a difference. The problem, though, was that the health visitors and the midwives and the GPs had said, this is good enough for us, don't put your baby on the front. I couldn't find any babies being put down on their front to include in this study. So by the end of 1989, this putting babies down on their back, had already occurred here in Bristol.
Yeah, because the change had happened.
It changed. And what we saw, in fact, we collected the data, we did very detailed analysis, but within 18 months, we saw that the SIDS rate in the Bristol area had fallen from 3 per 1,000 to less than 1 per 1,000. I went from 50 deaths in 1 year to 30 to 20 to 2.
My goodness.
Over a short period of time. So this was really, really impressive. By 1991, it was clear that something had happened here which hadn't happened in the rest of the country. Yeah. The only thing that was different was we were telling people not to put their babies down on their tummies. So in 1991, we pulled this data together. We presented it at the second meeting of the big international SIDS group. And in fact, that meeting, I for the first time met the group from New Zealand who were doing something very similar. We didn't even know of each other's existence, but we were doing very similar work, and they had exactly the same effect. So summer of 1991, I know, is terribly important to you, Anne, but that's when we first met.
Yes, it's when we first met.
And we had that data. We were ready to. We wanted to get people nationally to take notice of this. We submitted it to the British Medical Journal. It was going to be published, but getting things published is a long process. It takes about 6 months typically from sending it to actually coming out in the public domain. It's quicker now, but in those days, it was all printed on paper, and that was the only way you got it out. So, extraordinarily, I had permission from the editor of the BMJ to go
That's
public.
The British Medical Journal.
British Medical Journal, to go public with this before they'd actually published it. And he said that wouldn't affect their publication. They were going to publish it anyway, but it was so important that he wanted us to get this out there before the winter. And as you know, and you were absolutely crucial in that, getting government to listen to this, to take notice of it, was quite quite a job.
Because as you say, I mean, these things work so slowly,
Yeah.
up until then at least. And they wanted to set up committees and have working parties. And I mean, they were quite prepared to let it take a couple of years at least.
Absolutely. So that autumn of 1991, I was desperate that we were already running a campaign in the west of England. We'd expanded it to the whole of the west of England, but the government were still dragging their heels. But with your help, we managed to persuade them to do this. We ran this high-profile series of adverts on primetime television in the lead up to Christmas. And the effect of that was dramatic.
I knew that what we wanted was a very, very high-profile campaign. You had to get every single parent in Britain sitting up and listening and thinking, oh my God, when I put my baby down to sleep tonight, I'm going to make sure I put them on the back and not on their front, because that will save them against cot death. All you needed to do was have me say, because everybody knew that by then that I was the woman off the telly who'd had the cot death. I just put a baby down to sleep, and I said, if you're just about to put your baby down to sleep tonight, put him on his back, not on his front. This will save his, help save his life against cot death. It was a very simple 30-second advert, and immediately, we now know it saved lives. And within a year, the cot death rate had plummeted. At around the time that Sebastian died, we were losing 2,500 babies every single year to cot death. And that's 5 or 6 every single day. And that means that the day it happened to me, there probably were 4 or 5 other households, exactly the same tragedy happening. And then the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day.
Every day in Britain, at least 4 babies die from cot death. New research shows you can help reduce the risks for your baby. Sleep him on his back or side. If he's on his side, keep the underneath arm well forward, so that if he rolls, he'll roll onto his back, where he's safe. He mustn't roll onto his tummy. This is not a cure, but it really can help give your baby an extra chance of life.
Cot death is comparatively rare, but there are few things more tragic. Recent research has shown that if babies are laid down to sleep on their back or side, the risk of cot death can be greatly reduced. The Department of Health's new leaflet explains how anyone who looks after a young baby can help reduce the risk of cot death. Please call free on 0800 100 160 at any time for a free leaflet.
400 babies didn't die that winter who otherwise would have done if they'd had been the same as the winter before. That first winter we saved 400 lives.
And as you've said so many times, you can't point to them and say, those are the babies we've saved. But you know statistically
Absolutely.
that they are alive where they would have died.
Yeah. In Bristol here alone, we have a whole class full of children every year who now survive,
Peter,
who would have died had we not done this. So it was an extraordinary effect.
As a doctor, you don't expect things like that, really, do you?
No,
I mean, occasionally you get huge, miraculous medical breakthroughs, but this was exactly that.
It was, and it's been described, it's been reported in lots. This Back to Sleep campaign was probably the single most successful public health campaign ever in the UK. The effect was immediate. The numbers of deaths that had started to go up towards the end of October, November, as they had been doing every year before that, stopped going up. Literally, when the first programme came out, they stopped going up, and when we started the campaign, they started coming down, and they've never gone up again.
And the amazing thing about it is that while it had been a very difficult job for you, and a life's work, frankly, it was a very easy message to give out. I'll never forget the night after meeting you and we decided that the sort of campaign we were going to do. I got home and my accountant rang me. He'd just had twin sons. And he rang me late at night and he said, what did you find? What did you find? And I said, well, and I explained sleep position. And he said, oh my God, right, thank you so much. And he said, I've got to go. And I said, where are you going? He said, I'm going upstairs to turn the twins over. And I thought, wow, it was that simple.
It was that simple.
Okay, so look, anyone watching right now is going to say, brilliant, it worked. But why did it work? What is it about sleep position that affects a baby so badly?
I've spent the last 30 years, in a sense, trying to understand that. So over the period after that, we started to realise there were lots of other things that mattered too. My original thought of temperature and heavy wrapping was actually correct. It was the second most important factor. Exposure to parental smoking was a really important factor. And minor infections, coughs and colds, which were trivial, triggered a process which meant that it mattered. So there are lots of ways in which putting babies on their tummy adversely affects them. If we go back to historically, babies were never put on their back, on their front rather. If you can find a painting of a child sleeping on its front prior to about 1930, it'd be worth a fortune, because I don't think they exist. Because nobody ever put babies on their tummy.
So why did we start doing it?
We started doing it because, well, for a number of reasons. One was during the First and more importantly the Second World War, people became aware that when you were unconscious, you put people in the recovery position,
Yes.
which is partly on the tummy. People started looking at babies who often sick up a bit when they're asleep, and thinking, oh, they're a bit like unconscious people, let's put them on their tummy. No evidence at all, but when you put babies on their tummy, they sleep longer and they sleep deeper and they're harder to wake up. So if you value having lots of sleep and your baby having lots of sleep,
Which every new parent does.
It became the obvious thing to do. So there was no evidence to say it was good. And it took a long time for us to realise that what we'd changed in the 1940s, 50s and 60s was actually harming children. It was causing thousands of babies to die.
And for you as a doctor, as I said, it must have been the most incredible 30-year ride.
It was quite extraordinary. I mean, that they being from seeing two or three babies a week during the winter to going almost a whole year.
You must have turned to your colleagues and thought, something's happening.
Something has happened. It was a very strange experience. But the positive thing was we were collecting the information in huge detail as it was happening. So we were able to say nothing else has changed. We were able to be categorical about what it was that had changed, and the only thing that had changed was sleeping position. And it was, in other studies which have shown the effect, they haven't actually been able to collect that data in so much detail. So it's possible that it might have been attributed to other things. But because we were doing the study, we were collecting the data, we were studying these babies in minute detail, we knew what was happening. And what allowed us to do was to then go on with a whole series of further studies over the next 10 years or so, identifying other factors that were important, things that made a difference, that we could change. And gradually, as we've identified more and more of those, the rates started to come down further and further. And as my colleague Pete Blair will talk to you a bit later on, we went from around 1,500 such deaths at the beginning of this process to now 150, a 90% reduction over that period of time.
Which is amazing.
Which has been a wonderful thing to be involved in.
Professor Peter Blair, a lot of people will think, why aren't we in a sort of neonatal ward or something where there are lots of mothers and babies, because you're all about the health of babies. But actually we're more or less in an office with lots of computers. Yeah. Can you explain why that is? Why that you look at data more than babies themselves?
Yeah, so whereas a GP looks after the health and welfare of an individual infant, the epidemiologist looks after the health and welfare of the whole population. So what we're about is really looking at patterns in the population. So we do studies where we record details of babies that have died, look at the background of the families, look at that final sleep and the events that happened. And then we try and compare that with a healthy infant in the population around the same age, ask them exactly the same questions, talk about a sleep that happened in the last 24 hours and ask questions about that. And then we've got something to compare, and we can see what is actually putting babies at risk by comparing these two groups.
So is your background medicine or statistics and maths?
It is mathematics. I've got a mathematics degree and I've got statistics MSc as well.
So when you came here to be part of this team, your skills were at what you could give as a mathematician.
Exactly.
And analysing data.
That's right. So when I came here in '92, I was interviewed by Peter, who said that he had £1 million from the government to do some research, and I said that I didn't believe him because the government don't fund research. And then he explained about you and what had happened and the public outcry, and that all of a sudden this money was available. So it was a wonderful opportunity to do the study. I also did a PhD on the risk factors of SIDS as part of that as well, and I've sort of been in the field ever since, really, sort of, in what has been largely a successful 30 years.
It's been an incredible 30 years.
It's been brilliant, hasn't it?
Yeah. What was it like when you first started to delve into the subject itself?
So we knew about risk factors that Peter had found in the 80s. The Back to Sleep campaign was fantastic. There was 3 particular factors. There was infants being put down on their front to sleep was a danger. There was mother smoking during pregnancy. And there was overwrapping of infants. Infants being wrapped in TOG values which were far too large. 10 TOG sort of like infant duvets were on the shelves at the time. So we did this study, the KESDI study, between 1993 and 96.
KESDI being?
Confidential Inquiry into Stillbirth and Deaths in Infancy, which was supposed to be an audit, but as Peter said in the interview, yes, it is an audit, but on the back of that, we're going to do some bloody good research. So I thought, this is a man that I can work with.
Yeah, this was groundbreaking, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, and we discovered other risk factors. So as well as prone positioning, we found that infants who were put down on the side quite often fell prone. So the advice changed to back only was best. We found that infants that slept in rooms away from the parents, especially young infants, seemed to be a danger. So we started to advise that the baby should really be in the same room as the parents for the first few months, for nighttime and daytime sleeps, if possible. We also found that infants were found with their heads covered with bedding. So as well as being overwrapped, loose bedding seemed to be a problem. So there was advice on tucking sheets in firmly and having a firm, flat surface. But I think probably the biggest other risk that we found was related to bed sharing. It wasn't really noticeable in the 1980s, but I think with the advent of the Back to Sleep campaign and the massive fall in deaths, then a lot of the deaths that happened in a cot seemed to come down, but not so much when you're bed sharing, which is perhaps not surprising, because when you bed share with an infant, you often don't put them down in the prone position anyway, you put them on the side or their back to accommodate breastfeeding. So proportionally, we had more bed sharing deaths. So this was a problem, and we wanted to look at it.
Yeah, you wanted to look at it in more detail, because
exactly.
there are lots of factors that come into bed sharing, aren't there?
Yes.
As you just said, a lot of mothers will say it's good for breastfeeding.
Exactly, yes.
But it depends on, what are these other risk factors?
So there were some obvious things we found. Hazardous situations, parents who drank alcohol or took drugs and were bed sharing, which is an obvious no-no. Infants were found, they were bed sharing, but it wasn't in the bed, it was actually on the sofa, which is not a good place for an infant to sleep, given it's not a flat surface and you've got the back of the sofa. If an infant falls to sleep, they could get wedged between the parent and
But it's one
the
of
back
those
the
natural
sofa.
things, isn't it?
It is,
you love to have your baby fall asleep on your chest,
yes,
while you're maybe just sort of leaning back a bit watching the telly,
yes,
or something.
That's right.
And then I suppose it's a very natural thing to have a little nod off yourself, and that feels
yourself.
Lovely and natural and close.
It does, but it's really dangerous from an infant perspective.
Of course, no one ever gets over the loss of a child, and I never will. But over the last 30 years, it's been an amazing privilege to be able to work with the incredible doctors and scientists here at Bristol. And I started out my TV career here at the BBC. I could never have known the sort of journey I was about to embark on, from the BBC to the Palace.